Hello, and welcome to my channel. My name is Jonathan Cohn, and today I have my Best Books of the Year 2024 edition. I have so many books to talk about in this video because I read a ton in 2024. There is one more week remaining in 2024. I am going to be spending Christmas with my family, and I'm also going to be out of town, so I can't record videos. So I have like 2 or 3 books I'm going to try to squeeze in literally at the end of the year, but I usually record this to release around the end of the year anyway. So I'm recording this. As of right now, I've read 130 books this year, which is a great number. It's not as many as I did in 2023. That is my record at 142 books read. However, this year, I read way longer books and a lot more tomes. I read a ton of long books this year. And so because of that, I feel this is the most number of pages I've ever read in a single year by far. Not most number of books, but number of pages, absolutely. It's my number 1. For books, it's my number 2 best year so far. So I have different categories, and instead of doing a straight up top 10, which I might do a separate video for and release in January, but instead of doing a straight up top 10, I figured I would do kind of like the Cone Awards, talking about the best books in the different genres. And so I have gotten my stats for you to read, and then I'm going to go through and do a top 5, top 3, top 1, depending on what the best format is. We'll talk about the best books in each genre. So I read 26 fantasy books, 26 science fiction books, 23 Star Wars books, 19 Star Trek books, 13 YA or middle grade books. I read 7 historical fiction or contemporary books. I read 7 thrillers, specifically John Grisham thrillers. I read 3 horror novels, and I read 5 tie-in novelization type books. And then I read 1 nonfiction that was about a TV show. That was about the West Wing. But all told, I read 130 books in the year 2024, which is pretty darn good. So I'm going to go through each genre, talk about my top however many. So for fantasy, I'm going to talk about the top 5 books I read this year. And I want to just admit, Wind and Truth barely missed out being in the top 5. It was like barely out of the top 5. But my number 5 fantasy read of the year is Fire and Blood by George R.R. Martin. This is a historical book. This is as if it's like fake history set within the Targaryen dynasty in Westeros. It is dark. It is very political. It is really deep. I really had a blast with this book. And this video either is already out or will be out in the next few days. But for all the rest of the books I'm going to talk about, the video is probably already out. So look up the title of the video and my name, and you will find it. And I had a blast with this one. That's the number 5 fantasy of the year for me. I'm not going to go too in depth on these. My number 4 fantasy book of the year for me was Shadow of the Smoking Mountain by Howard Andrew Jones. It is ending the first arc in his proposed Chronicles of Henovar series. I don't know if we'll get more in the series, but this is a very entertaining book. I think that Howard Andrew Jones just writes sword and sorcery fantasy in just a great historical way that I really respect and admire, and I had a blast with this book. It's not as good as the first 2 books, which last year were at the top of my list, but it's still a really good book. My number 3 is going to be a self-published fantasy book titled A Silent Country by Morgan Shank. This is an incredibly consistently good fantasy trilogy. Each book is really short. It's like 250 pages-ish, and Morgan just is an excellent fantasy writer. He writes fantasy and mixed with Western here, and I just loved it. And so this was my number 3 fantasy of the year. I also read a very different type of fantasy book. This is Monster Hunter Memoirs Fever. This is like a pulpy action fantasy about guys who hunt monsters. And this one is set in the 70s, and it's set in California, and it's written by Larry Correia and Jason Cordova. And I had a blast. I had a smile on my face. This is just such a fun book. It's pretty short, but it's such a fun book. You cannot help but have a smile on your face reading it. It's my favorite of the Monster Hunter books I've read, but I plan to read more of them eventually because I'm really having a blast with this series. That's my number 2. But my number 1 is an easy number 1 because it was my number 1 fantasy read of the year, and that is The Silverblood Promise by James Logan. Everybody else gave this like a 4 out of 5 stars, and I'm thinking they're crazy because it was like a 5-star all the way for me. Brilliant book, great twists, great side quests, great plot arc, great characters to follow, great dynamic between them, great mystery behind the book. Just everything about this book hit just for me. I loved it all. Now, if you're seeing this and you're like, hang on, there's some books missing. Some books that are categorized as fantasy, I'm categorizing as historical fiction because I think it fit better in there. As historical fiction, and I'll discuss that when I get to that section. But that's my fantasy books. Let's talk about my top science fiction books of the year. There were some good ones, but there's kind of a theme you'll see with my top science fiction of the year. So let's start with my number 5 is Worlds Long Lost by edited by Christopher Rocchio and Sean Korsgaard. This is a short story collection, a science fiction short story collection based on the premise of what if there are previous worlds or civilizations or aliens or whatever. There's previous things in our universe that, have yet to be uncovered. And so as you do archaeology, as you do space exploration, as you do science, you are learning about these old worlds long lost, basically. And I loved this short story collection. There were a few that didn't hit, and I'm not a short story fan. I'm really not. But the short stories in here were wonderful. They were just stupendous. I loved these short stories, and I did reviews of literally every single short story in YouTube short form, and then of course I reviewed the whole book in a long form. So I really enjoyed this one. That's my number 5. My number 4 science fiction read of the year is Men of Britain by Richard Fox. After reading Richard Fox's Light of the Veil, I wasn't sure that I would love other of his books, but I decided to give one a chance, and I read Men of Britain, and I loved it. It's a great short science fiction novel. It is a military science fiction. It's very much about these soldiers that are fighting in this war, get stranded on this planet, and their goal is to try to make it back home. And it's got military humor, it's got great action, it's got adventure, got great themes and stuff. I had a blast with this one. That's my number 4, science fiction. My number 3 science fiction read of the year is a duology, and I'm counting them together because they would have been, ranked together, and that'll happen a couple times on this list. But my number 3 is the Jupiter duology by Ben Bova. You have the first book, Jupiter, and you have the second book, Leviathans of Jupiter. I read both of these this year. I loved them both, particularly Leviathans of Jupiter. These books just have such incredible world building and such incredible themes and ask such deep questions and also have great plot arcs and great characters and really are just fun science fiction. This is primarily a hard sci-fi space exploration book series, part of the Grand Tour universe, but this particular duology has a little bit of creature feature. I'm not a fan of creature feature, so the fact that this is a hard sci-fi with a tinge element of the creature feature makes it palatable for me, and I really enjoyed it. And let me just tell you, when you get to the Leviathans in these books, when you get to those chapters where our main characters are encountering the Leviathans, turn on the Jupiter soundtrack from Holst, Gustav Holst. You will not be disappointed. Those are amazing songs that's amazing music to pair with these and really fits thematically. So I loved these books. My number 2 science fiction read of the year is going to go to another Ben Bova book, Mars Life. This is the end of the Mars sequence. The first book is one of my favorite science fiction books of all time. The second book, is fine. It's not great, it's not terrible. The third book is amazing. This book is just a great discussion of when religion gets involved with space travel and when religion dictates political stuff. And it's also a great book about funding. You would think the idea of funding space exploration would be the most boring topic ever. Not in this book. It's awesome, and it's really excellently handled. And I was just riveted by the whole discussion, and I loved reading Mars Life. And so that is why it's my number 2 science fiction read of the year. My number 1 science fiction read of the year, if you had told me a year ago I was reading this, I would not believe you. But my number 1 science fiction read of the year is Mountain of Fire by Jason Cordova. The reason I'm counting this as science fiction instead of horror is it's more action based and it's like more like a thriller, but it is sci-fi because the subject material of the zombies. It's really hard to categorize. I could have put this in thriller, in sci-fi, or in horror. I decided to put it in sci-fi because I felt like that's where the publisher put it in, so that's what I'm going to put it in. But this is an excellent book. This is about a Catholic school for girls up in the mountains, and when the zombie outbreak happens around the world, and specifically around the U.S., these girls have to kind of wall themselves off from the rest of society to try to survive. And you're following one of the older girls at the school who kind of becomes a leader at the school, and her job is to protect all the other girls, and it's from her perspective, and it's hilarious, and it is great action. It has great comedy. It's a really fun, quick read. And Jason Cordova is just a terrific action writer and also humor writer as well. I loved it. So this is my number 1 sci-fi read of the year. If you're one of those people that says that's not really sci-fi, fine, then consider Mars Life my number 1 sci-fi book of the year. But I mean, you guys can figure it out. All right. We've done those categories. Let's move on to the tie-in categories. I have 3 tie-in categories I'm going to talk about. I have Star Wars specific, I have Star Trek specific, and then I have general tie-in. Because I like to separate these out because I read a lot of tie-ins. If you include Star Wars, Star Trek, and general tie-ins, I'm at 40-something tie-ins, and I felt it would be better to split them up. So I have 4/5 Star Wars books to do, and then I'll move on to the others. So first for Star Wars. My number 4 on the list for Star Wars is Jedi Trial by, who are the authors? David Sherman and Dan Cragg. And this is exactly what I've been wanting in a Clone Wars novel. I've not been the biggest fan of the EU Clone Wars novels. I've read a lot of them at this point, and none of them were hitting. And everyone else is like, you didn't love this one? How could you possibly not? You didn't love this one? How could you possibly not? This one, nobody else seems to love. I loved it. I had a blast with it. It is a military story featuring, Anakin is one of the main characters, taking a group of clones to this planet to fight the droids. And there's other characters as well who are part of the Republic forces and the planetary forces who you follow their perspectives as well. But it is a Clone Wars novel in the most simple sense, and I loved it. I had such a blast with this. So this is my number 4 of the year for Star Wars, and I'd read like 23 Star Wars books, so this is quite up there. My number 3 is going to be a canon novel. This is the only canon novel on the list, and that is Tears of the Nameless by George Mann. I've not been the biggest YA fan, but man, did they finally have a YA book that just broke through. You're following Amadeo Azazu, or is it Azazu Amadeo? Anyway, you're following him, and you're following Reith Silas as they are trying to uncover mysteries about the Nameless, and you can feel the palpable fear of the Nameless in this book, and you can really see what they've been building towards from phases 1 and 2 of the High Republic. You see what they're building to for phase 3, and this is just a terrific book. It is the best Star Wars book published in 2024. Really, this was a quite lackluster year otherwise, but this is one that stood out. So, that's my number 3. My number 2 is 2 books that I'm, basically at a tie. And that's going to be 2 of the Han Solo trilogy books. The first book, The Paradise Snare, and the third book, Rebel Dawn. I think those are both pretty much at the same level. I think they're both just as good. I think Paradise Snare, I prefer a little bit more because of just the kind of Indiana Jones type nature of the book. It's really tightly plotted. I think it's really just unique and creative, and everything about it hit. This Rebel Dawn is an amazing book as well, and I had a blast reading it as a Star Wars book, but it didn't feel as tight as Paradise Snare is. But I loved both of these, and these are just up there as some of the top Star Wars books I've read, and I had a blast reading these books at the beginning of the year, and that's why this is my number 2. But my number 1 is the book I literally finished today as I'm recording this, and boy did it earn its spot, and it blew me away, and I was like, yeah, I'm going to make this video today, but I don't think that this book's going to make it on there. Oh boy it did. Oh boy it did. And that is Darth Maul Shadowhunter. This is like a it is like a horror action thriller where the monster is Darth Maul, and it's just so tightly paced, so excellently crafted, so action-packed, so scary, but not actually legitimately scary. Like a preteen could read this, a teenager could read this, an adult could read this. All of you are going to enjoy it, but you will feel that palpable fear in the book. And it's just got such great characters, such great plot, such great everything, and it's really short. It's a nice, quick, read it in a day or two read. So I loved Darth Maul Shadowhunter. Alright, so those were my top Star Wars books of the year. Let's talk about my top Star Trek. I have 3 slots I'm going to talk about here. In my number 3 slot is one of those Star Trek books published this year, and that is Lost to Eternity by Greg Cox. I was actually too harsh on this book when it came out. I actually really loved it, and as time has gone on, it's the one Star Trek book this year that I keep thinking about and reminiscing and enjoying. This book is set in 3 different timelines. The most interesting to me was the timeline set in 2024, where these podcasters are researching the mysterious disappearance of Gillian Taylor, who is the scientist that goes missing during Star Trek IV. And so you get to revisit a lot of the events of Star Trek IV and through the podcaster's eyes. And they're interviewing people 40 years later, and they're doing all of these discussions. And I loved it. I thought it was so creative. I thought it was so fun to get to reminisce about this stuff, re-see the scenes in new ways. And then, of course, there is the typical Star Trek storyline in here, and there is a way that ties the podcast to the Star Trek timeline with Saavik that I thought was really well done. And the ending of this book is just beautifully sad and well written. And I think that Greg Cox did a tremendous job with this book, and that's why it's my number 3. My number 2 Star Trek book for the year is The Nanotech War by Stephen Pizix. I read this for the podcast Literary Treks that I am a part of, and I was just excited to do a Voyager book, because I hadn't gotten to read a Voyager book in a long time, because I'd read all of Kirsten Byers' ones and most of Christy Golden's. And so I was like, I didn't know that there was a book that was not a numbered Star Trek Voyager book left for me to read. So I picked up The Nanotech War and was delighted by it. It feels like the perfect Voyager novel. It feels like this could have been, Stephen Pizix could have made this into a 2-episode arc for season 7, and it would have fit perfectly as a 2-episode arc for season 7. But this has a great 7 of 9 storyline that is really deep and asks a lot of questions, but it also has a tremendous Tom and B'Elanna. Tom is the character who's on the page, on the cover, but it's really B'Elanna who goes through the ringer in this book. And her journey of trying to figure out what to do with Tom when the things happen to him in this book is so good. So good. I think that Stephen Pizix knocked it out of the park. And would have been the best Star Trek book of the year had it not been for my number 1, which is kind of a duology, part of a trilogy. Anyway, and that is the IKS Gorkin books is my number 1 Star Trek book of the year. A Good Day to Die and Honorbound are basically a duology. What happened was this was part of a 3-book series that was written. The first 2 books are basically one book split. And then the 3rd book is its own separate thing that continues on the story. But the first 2 books, for all intents and purposes, are a duology. And Keith DeCandido did a superb superb job writing these books. There's no Federation characters really. I think that Picard shows up for like one scene in Honor Bound, and Worf shows up in both books briefly. But it's entirely from the perspective of the Klingons from the Klingon Empire, and you are seeing them as they go out to conquer. Instead of to explore strange new worlds, it is to conquer strange new worlds, and you see the Klingon Empire going to expand and conquer. If Keith DeCandido had written like 10 or 15 of these nice short quick books in succession that are following the Klingons, if this had been like the New Frontier where they had just Peter David did like 15 or 20 books in that series, if they had let Keith DeCandido just do like 15 or 20 nice short books in the series, I think that it could have been one of the best things in Star Trek publishing, because this is just superb. It gets Klingons right. Keith DeCandido is the only person besides John Jackson Miller that I just think intrinsically understands Klingons, and I loved these two books, and I'm counting them as like one because really it's one novel split literally halfway through. It is literally split between two acts, so it's brilliantly written. That's my top Star Trek books of the month, of the year. Now we're going to go on to talk about my top media tie-in books of the year. These are going to be, I read, I think, 5 media tie-in books this year, and I'm going to talk about basically the top 3. And these 3 were all just so good that I have to talk about them really quick. First, I'm going to talk about my number 3 and my number 2, which are both Halo novels. I read Halo: The Fall of Reach and Halo: First Strike. I loved these books. Halo: The Fall of Reach is like a direct prequel to the video game, the first Halo video game, and then First Strike is like a direct sequel to the video game. There is an adaptation of the video game with Halo: The Flood. It's not that great a book, but The Fall of Reach and First Strike are great books. And Eric Nyland just has a way of writing this kind of military science fiction that I really love. I think that he gets how to write sci-fi, he gets how to write tie-in to the Halo franchise, he also gets how to write entertaining stories. And I think that he did a terrific job with both of these books. And I cannot wait to read more Halo books once I get my hands on them, because I don't have any more really to read next. I have a few that are like way down the line, but not any to read next. I want to read the next books in the series, so I'm really excited. And I have this, that's my number 3, First Strike, and my number 2, Fall of Reach. Fall of Reach is a tad better, but they're both great books. And now for my number 1 tie-in novel of the year. And this is, seriously, if I counted Star Wars, Star Trek, and Halo and other stuff, all my tie-in books together, this book would be the undisputed champion. And that is Batman Resurrection by John Jackson Miller. This is one of my top books of the year in general. I loved this book. John Jackson Miller wrote a Star Wars book this year that was good. It wasn't amazing. It was just good. This book is stellar. It is a Batman novel set in the 1989 universe. It is a direct sequel to the 1989 movie. It is telling the events of, what happened after the Joker's death, who took over the Gotham crime stuff, who are the next villains that Batman had to fight, how did Bruce Wayne react to losing some things in the movie, how did he react to now his parents, he's avenged his parents from the movie. All this stuff is discussed in this book. And John Jackson Miller is just an amazing writer, and we're getting a sequel next year, and I'm so excited. So that is my number 1 tie-in fiction novel of the year. Loved it across all media tie-in fiction. It was the best book I read this year for tie-in fiction. All right, let's go ahead and go to my next category, which is going to be my thriller category. I read 7 thriller novels by John Grisham. He is a tremendous thriller writer, and his books were so good, I'm like, I have to talk about 5 of them. I'll go really briefly through these. I read Playing for Pizza, which is about a football player who gets injured and can't do any American football, so he goes and does Italian American football. It is American football in Italy, basically, and it is a delightfully fun book. It's worth the read. Then I read my number 4 thriller book by him is The Associate, and I just palpably was stressed reading this book because of how excellently written it is. A new young lawyer is blackmailed into spying on a law firm. And I was so worried because he just is so worried about the law catching him and going to jail. He's worried about his losing his job there. He's worried about there's this information about his past that he does not want to get out, and that information is there. And you also want to catch the bad guys. And I was on edge reading this book, and it's so good, and that's why it's my number 4. It's just such a tremendous thriller. John Grisham, one of my favorite authors. This year solidified him as one of my favorite authors. I mean, every year I say that, but every year I read great stuff from him. I also read his novel, The Appeal. Very different type of story. This is a political story. An oil spill happens not an oil spill, but a chemical spill happens in this book. And there is a businessman who wants to avoid having to go to court over this. And so he starts bribing these politicians to run for the state Supreme Court in Mississippi. And so you're following that political process. And there's also these lawyers who are trying to fight the process, and they're also against this guy running, and there's great political dialogue here. And it's just such a fun book. And also you're like, these guys are terrible, but they're also very ingenious, and you gotta respect them. So I loved The Appeal. I also read my number 2 John Grisham book of the year. Was the most deep and thought-provoking John Grisham book. That was The Chamber. This book is about a guy on death row who they're trying to get him off death row. And there's this lawyer who is completely against the death penalty, and yet he wants to protect this guy, and he's this guy who's kind of a horrible guy. And I thought that this book was just so, it made me think about the death penalty so much. And I disagree with what John Grisham is writing here. I disagree with his worldview on a lot of stuff, and yet he writes it so well. And I really had to think about it afterwards, and I was very impressed by what I read about in The Chamber. But my number 1 John Grisham book of the year, one of my top books in general for the year, blew me away, was The Testament. This book, I would love to see a movie of this book. In fact, I had someone comment and say that their life was, on one of my videos, saying their life was changed by the events of this book. I thought it was incredible. This book is about a wealthy man dies and leaves all his money to this random woman who lives in South America in a really, really, touched part of South America, where she is a missionary to the local natives there. And so she has no access to phones, no access to internet. She is totally on her own. She has no access to knowing that she has just become a billionaire. And so the main character is a lawyer who is trying to travel to South America to tell her about her inheritance. And I've never seen an author, understand Christianity and the heart of Christianity better than in this book. And I was impressed by John Grisham's writing. I was impressed by the themes he tackled, and this book moved me. This book moved me when I read it. So this is my number 1 thriller book of the year. All right, what's the next category I'll cover? Let's cover historical fiction next. And you know what? No, I'm going to save historical fiction for a moment. I'm going to talk about horror. I read 3 horror books this year. I read It, which I thought was fine. I didn't love it. I was mixed on it. There was things I liked, things I didn't like about it. And then I read It Will Only Hurt for a Moment. And there were things I liked about it, things I didn't like about it. So those 2 books, they're not making the list. But my best horror book of the year was Misery by Stephen King. A Stephen King book I actually really enjoyed reading. It's about a writer who gets in an accident, and he is nursed back to health by this obsessed fan who is not actually nursing him to health. Instead, she keeps him hobbled to try to keep him writing books for her. And it is dark, it is creepy, it is excellently written and plotted, and I loved Misery. I loved it so much. All right, so next I'll do YA. For YA in middle grade, I decided to really put an emphasis on reading more YA in middle grade this year. I said I'm going to make it part of my monthly TBR. Every month is going to have one. And you know what? I read 13 YA/middle grade books this year. So you know what? I'm pretty proud of myself because I averaged one a month. And I read some great YA books in middle grade. Instead of do individual books, I'm going to talk about series because one series would just dominate the list mostly. So I'm just going to talk about individual or overall series. And so the number 3 series that I read for YA in middle grade was Twilight. I know everybody loves hating on Twilight. Get all the hate out. I get it. I loved reading these books. The second one was good. The third one I didn't love it. But the first and fourth book, I really had a blast. I had a blast reading. I know it's cheesy. I know that there's some weird elements to Stephenie Meyer's writing style and things she decides to focus on that other people would not. But I loved reading these books. And I really enjoy this kind of fun, cozy type experience reading these books. And you know what? I'm Team Edward all the way. So... I've run out of room. I'll just set it on the floor. All right. My number 2 middle grade YA series I read this year was the Fablehaven series, which I loved the Fablehaven series, particularly the first book and the last book. Fablehaven is just an excellently written, excellently plotted series. It is basically Narnia meets Harry Potter, and I think it is delightful. I think this is the type of series that I think young boys would love reading. I wish I had this series was around when I was a kid, but I didn't read it because I wasn't a reader at the time. I didn't know that series like this existed. I wish I had because this is a delightful book series. And Seth and Kendra, excellent characters. Loved this middle grade series. And there's 5 in the main series, and then there's some spin-off series. My number 1 YA/middle grade series that I read this year was the Divergent series by Veronica Roth. Much like Twilight, there's stuff you can hate about these books. I understand why you might not like them personally. I had a blast. I think that this is the type of dystopian YA that I actually really enjoy. I think that Veronica Roth writes her main characters really well. I think she writes the action well. I think the world building is very interesting to me. I know it's not interesting to other people, but it is to me. And I blew through these books in January. I just went boom, 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 boom. I just read them so fast. I had such a blast with them. So that is Divergent, which I loved. And that was my favorite YA middle grade series that I read. All right, now for my final category, which is going to be historical fiction. And this category I saved for last, specifically because it's my favorite category. I just read this for the first time this year. I had not really read historical fiction. There might have been times in my past where I'd read historical fiction not knowing it, but this year I made a conscious decision after watching some of Brian Lee Durfee's videos and some of Red Fury Books' videos and Mike's Book Reviews. I watched all of their videos and decided to start picking up some historical fiction, and I was blown away by what I read, particularly from 2 authors. 3 of these books are from one author, and so we'll start with my number 5 historical fiction read of the year is A Column of Fire by Ken Follett. This is part of his Kingsbridge series, which I'll talk about in a moment, but this is the most historical fictioniest of the series. It's really focused on the Protestant versus Catholics wars in England during the 1500s and beginning of the 1600s, and it's just layered with historical discussions and historical events, and I just loved reading this book. I had a blast with it. It's a big book. It's a long book. My number 4 is a book called The Help, which I considered putting this in like the thriller category, but I had a blast reading The Help. Yes, it tackles racism and really some difficult issues about the South, interestingly. But I thought it was really exciting. I read it pretty quickly. I had a blast. It's a fun book to read. I think it's a nice, heartwarming type book by the end, and I think the movie is also pretty excellent. My number 3 is the book World Without End, which is just a behemoth of a book but it's so enjoyable. This is the book in the Ken Follett Kingsbridge series that is following the that is following like the Black Plague era of Europe, and you're following in Kingsbridge as they're building not only a bridge, a new bridge, but they're also building a hospital on an island, and it is so good. It would be a top book of the year if not for these others. Now, for my number 2 historical fiction books of the year, these could be categorized as fantasy. And way back at the beginning of the video, I said there were some fantasy books that are, shelved as fantasy in the bookstore, but I felt more comfortable shelving them as historical fiction for my shelves because the books are really historical fiction books that identify as fantasy. And that is the Nightingale and the Falcon series by Stephen Arion. This is the first 2 books in a trilogy. I read both of these this year. I loved it. This is basically a historical fiction about the Mongols as they are conquering through Western Europe, conquering through western parts of Asia, approaching Western Europe. And you are following people from the Mongolian Empire, from the Iraqis and the Iranis and the Pakistanis and everyone who hates the Mongols. And it's all about who's going to destroy the Mongolian Empire, specifically this caliphate of it. And it is brilliantly written. Excellent action, excellent characters, excellent discussions in here. There is a tinge of fantasy. There's that one character who has fantastical powers, and so you could be like, oh, that's why it's fantasy. But really, that's not enough, in my opinion, to shelve it as a fantasy. I count it as a historical fiction, and I loved it. I loved these 2 books. Maybe Judas Blossom a little bit more, but still I loved these 2 books. And so those are my number 2 historical fiction read of the year. My number 1 historical fiction read of the year is also my number 1 read of the year, period. End of discussion. Favorite read of the year has to go to Ken Follett's Pillars of the Earth. This is the first book in the Kingsbridge series. This is an epic story about building the cathedral in the fake city of Kingsbridge, England. And it has romance, and it has evil bad guys, and it has battles, and it has political intrigue, and it has religious discussion, and it has interesting worldview discussions. It is just superb, stupendous, all the accolades I can throw on this. This is the best book of the year by far. It's in my top books ever now. I literally read this book like a week after I recorded my favorite books of all time video. And so now I'm like, I need to remake the video because I have a new book in that list. I don't know where it is in my top 10 books of all time, but it's somewhere in there because it's amazing. And Ken Follett, you knocked it out of the park with this book. Now, I totally disagree with him on a lot of stuff, but man, did Ken Follett write entertaining stories. He still does. And so I have more Ken Follett books to read next year. There will be a lot of Ken Follett in 2025. But I loved Pillars of the Earth. So that is all of the best books of the year. That's not even all the books I read. Those are just the best ones that I wanted to talk about. So if you've read any of these categories and you've read any of these books, let me know what you liked about them, what you didn't like, what are you shocked to see on the list, and what was your best books and worst books of the year. And until next time, I'm Jonathan, and thank you for watching.